The life of Mollie Fitzgerald. Maurice Casey wrote her chapter. Maurice is from Cahir and is also the historian in residence at EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum. He started by explaining a bit about Mollie's background.
So Mollie was the fourth of 8 children, and she was born in June of 1899 into the family of Michael Fitzgerald, who was a labourer, and his wife Bridget Burke. Now, of course, the labouring class, the labourers in Ireland, would have lived very precarious existences, and you can see this really in the structure of the house in which they grew up, which was, even by the standards of the time, quite a small and cramped dwelling for the size of their family. So for the first few years of Mollie's life, the family remained in Ballydrehead, a townland outside Cahir, residing in the home of Mollie's grandmother, living also with an uncle Matthew. Between 1901 and 1911, this household, the Fitzgerald household, was struck by a number of tragedies. So first, her grandmother, with whom Mollie had lived since birth, died in December 1902. Next, within a month of the grandmother's death, Mollie and the family had relocated and resided at Lower Cahir Abbey, where her father now had a position as caretaker. When Mollie was just 6 years of age, her youngest sibling, Ellen, died aged 10 months. And the fourth event, which was probably the most upsetting of all for Mollie, was the death of her mother, leaving Michael, her father, with the 6 surviving children to take care of. And the house where they lived for much of this time, I visited it myself. It's in a state of semi-ruin. And at the time, it would have been a thatched cottage. Now, of course, there's an aluminium roof on top, but it's a small, more or less simply 2-room abode where you could imagine that this family had rather cramped conditions. The family had quite poor land outside. It was one of the things that many people commented upon the Fitzgerald's early household, that the land was quite poor for farming. They had a cow, pig, and hens, and yet the income would still have been quite minimal for a farm labourer. So when Mollie would have been around her mid-teen years, around 15 years old, her older brother, who's 2 years older than her, David, headed off to London. And here David gets involved in Irish nationalist politics. One of the letters he writes home is requesting Hurley, because he wants to get involved in the local GA team. And at the time in which he was involved in local GA in London, there was another figure involved who David may have met at this point and who would have a profound impact on the future direction of the Fitzgerald family. That man was Michael Collins. David would become trusted and would become closely connected with Michael Collins later in the War of Independence. During the War of Independence, the Fitzgeralds were heavily involved. David was involved with the IRA in Britain, particularly in Tyneside, and David and Mollie's younger brother, Matthew, was also involved in a flying column in Tipperary.
Given Mollie came from such a poor background, Maurice explained how he found some of this information about her life not in an archive, but in a house in Cahir.
Now, what's interesting is that, as is the case with so much local history, and why these kind of projects are so interesting to get involved in and so interesting to get off the ground, you simply don't know what kind of documents are sitting in people's houses. So I was fortunate enough to visit the Fitzgerald household. One remarkable thing in the kitchen is that there's still a framed photo of the Irish Socialist Republican, Pat O'Donnell. And when I looked to the bookcase, you could see the political development and the political connections of the Fitzgerald family basically playing out in the books themselves. I picked a Pat O'Donnell book off the shelf and I opened it up, and there was a series of letters inside. They were written by, they were signed Micheál O'Congola, and initially it didn't register, and then I translated the name. Of course, these were letters from Michael Collins. And so these letters were describing essentially what must have been quite traumatic period for Mollie and for her family, which is that David essentially went missing in the sort of maelstrom of the Irish War of Independence. And David's father, Michael, was writing to Michael Collins asking him to reveal the whereabouts or whether his son, David, was indeed alive. Michael Collins said that he had investigated on David's behalf and couldn't find any details on his whereabouts. But David indeed was alive and would survive indeed to break with his old comrade Michael Collins, along with the rest of the Fitzgerald family, in supporting the anti-treaty forces during the Irish Civil War.
Mollie would become a revolutionary in the 1930s. Morris explained her path from rural South Tipperary into the world of radical politics.
It's difficult to place exactly where Mollie gets involved in radical politics. It seems that she was living in Dublin by at least the late 20s. And if we consider her as being part of her brother's social world, David's, then this was a sort of vibrant and thriving world of the Republican left, which existed and which played out in, for example, a cabaret on Harcourt Street, where a lot of the Republican left used to meet, in the drawing rooms of figures such as Charles Despard and Maud Gonne, who had a house called Roebuck House, which was in Clonskee, where a lot of the Republican left met as well. And this allows us to place Mollie on the historical record.
A very important figure in Mollie's life was her older brother David, and it appears a trip he undertook to the Soviet Union would have a huge bearing on Mollie's life when he encountered another Irish revolutionary, Charlotte Despard.
In 1930, Mollie's older brother David travels to the Soviet Union, and on board that ship with him, the Soviet ship SS Korporacja, which navigated the London to Leningrad route during the 1930s, on board that ship is Harry Kurnoff, the Dublin Jewish painter, the revered feminist Tanashi Skeffington, and Charlotte Despard. Charlotte Despard, for any of your listeners who may not be familiar with her, was an Anglo-Irish suffragette, a very staunch revolutionary, was involved in every radical left Irish cause you can think of, from her relocation to Dublin in 1921 until her death in 1939. And this is all the more remarkable because this is at the late stage of a long life. So she was exhorting revolution from platforms even into her late 80s. There'd be a very important impact from Mollie of her older brother David's comradeship with Charlotte Despard. And that's because this aged Anglo-Irish revolutionary required a secretary, in many cases kind of personal carer, to take into her staff. And that person was Mollie. So Mollie, in the last era, really, of Despard's long activist career, was very close to Despard. Margaret Mulvihill, in her biography of Despard, has found out details of how Mollie helped Charlotte Despard, for example, transcribing various revolutionary poetry that she used to write, and also just really acting as her personal assistant.
When Despard moved to Belfast in the 1930s, Mollie went with her. Morris details her life there and how Charlotte Despard's death set Mollie on a collision course with her relatives.
When Mollie relocates to Belfast and she becomes involved in helping Despard in the last stage of Despard's activist career, for example, bringing her along to solidarity meetings with the Spanish solidarity meetings in aid of the Spanish Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War. She also becomes connected with a man named Jack Mulvena, who is a local member of the Belfast branch of Republican Congress, and he was a part of Despard's Belfast staff as well. One contemporary of Despard's in an oral history remembered this duo of Jack and Mollie being sort of flippant youths who spent their time riding in the staff car and smoking cigarettes. Despard, however, was clearly very fond of these staff members. And indeed, Mollie was with Despard in her last moments. Despard died in late 1939, and it was Mollie who was the last person to see Despard alive. And she died after, I believe it was a fall down her staircase. And her last words were spoken in German to Mollie, and they were sweet dreams and silent repose, apparently. Later then in Glasnevin ceremony, where Despard was buried, amongst the other luminaries in the history of Irish nationalism, Mollie laid a wreath for Despard inscribed from your own Mollie. Mollie's sister Breed as well, another sister of David, accompanied Mollie at the funeral. And all of this shows the sort of the esteem that Despard had for Mollie and the place that Mollie had within that sort of that wider world. And the death of Despard opens up this quite sad epilogue to what we know of Mollie's life. Despard came from a wealthy background, although I would say that by the end of Despard's life, her family fortune had been whittled down quite severely, and that inheritance was to go to Despard's staff, Mollie and Jack. However, Despard's family, so the French family, she was born, of course, not Charlotte Despard, but Charlotte French. The French family enter into a legal dispute contesting the right of Jack and Mollie to inherit this estate. And really what you're seeing here, I suppose, is the French family's distaste for their wealth going into the hands of what they would have seen as disreputable revolutionary agitators. And so this legal dispute drained really whatever money was left in that estate. And it's really unlikely that Jack or Mollie would have received any of the money which Despard had bequeathed to them.
As is often the case with working class figures in history, Mollie's later life is something of a mystery. However, as Maurice explains, someone listening to this right now, maybe yourself, might actually hold the answer to this mystery.
Mollie disappears. We haven't been able to trace a death certificate for her, and we haven't been able to find, for example, we haven't been able to find out whether she had any children. It's unusual because the Fitzgerald family memory and the memory of the Fitzgeralds in the local Cahir area is quite strong. And I'll give you one interesting story that represents that. I gave a talk about David Fitzgerald and also mentioning what I knew about Mollie a few years ago in Cahir House Hotel. And just after I began my talk, a quite elderly woman came into the hall and sat down quite close to the front. When we spoke to that woman after the talk, she revealed that she was at the talk because she remembers in 1933 as a child being brought to David Fitzgerald's funeral in Cahir. This would have been a funeral that would have been attended by people like Despard, by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, by Pat O'Donnell, Frank Ryan, George Gilmore. She remembered that event, and she remembered being at it because her father told her that this is the death of an important man, and it's important that you attend this. And then decades later, that woman in her 80s comes to this talk and to learn more about David Fitzgerald. So Mollie's life and the sources for Mollie's life are like that in a way, in that there are moments where we can find very specific and detailed information on where she was and who she was with, and then years of just total blankness and an inability to find out what there is. If that historical shroud is to be illuminated, then it will be illuminated by people like that woman who came to the talk. Because Mollie may have been alive into the 80s or into the 90s. I believe my instinct is that she remained in Belfast. And so there may be people listening to this who remember her, who know people who remembered her. And so if they are, then I'd love to hear from them.